Hello everyone and welcome to a special episode of Fiscal Fridays. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel to get the latest updates on Idaho politics in your newsfeed. Idaho Public Schools received a 16% budget increase in general funds alone this year, but many districts have decided that that isn't enough. Several school districts throughout the state have large levy elections up for consideration on Tuesday. But between the additional $330 million spent during the special session, the $145 million spent on teacher pay increases, and nearly $300 million in unspent federal COVID funding, do public schools really have to root through your pocketbook too? To help answer this question, we brought in IFF's Senior Analyst of Education Policy Research, Branden Durst. Branden is a former legislator and is regarded throughout Idaho as an expert in education policy. Branden has been following this issue of levies closely this year and is working to help educate the public on how they would be impacted if these levies pass. Thank you, Branden, for joining us today.
Thanks, Niklas. Good to see you.
So, Idaho Public Schools are slated to receive their largest budget ever at $2.7 billion in general funds alone. This revenue is collected from just the tax revenue in the state. This omits all of that dedicated funding, all of the COVID funding that they're set to receive. They even just received that $330 million back in September. And so why are they coming to the taxpayers to ask for more funding now?
You know, that's a really interesting question. I think that, notwithstanding the gigantic increase in general fund appropriation, you also point out the amount of federal funds, which is at an all-time high for our school districts. The dedicated fund, which we're seeing, and that's at its largest peak that we've seen in a long time as well. What's interesting is that districts are trying to pretend like they don't have all this money when they actually do. And I think what they're trying to do is trying to trick property taxpayers, frankly, and voters into thinking that things are lean when in fact they're better than ever.
That's amazing. And so what are some of the key bond levy elections that we're looking at throughout the state? So what are the ones that we should be paying attention to?
There's three in particular that I'm watching. The first and probably and by far the largest is in the West Ada School District, which is formerly known as the Meridian School District, West Ada County. That one is a $500 million levy. And they're running it as a plant facilities levy, which we can talk about more later. But they're running that. It's $500 million, and that's just a ginormous number. There were not more than a decade and a half ago, that would have been, a sizable chunk of the entire state appropriation for public schools. The second one that I'm watching personally is in Coeur d'Alene, the Coeur d'Alene School District. They're trying to rerun a levy that failed back in March, and they're trying to rerun that levy again. And then the third is also up north, and that's in the Lakeland School District, where they're trying to do the same thing. They lost a levy back in March, and they're trying to seek that levy out to try to pass it again.
So why do schools get to continue to bring these levies up over and over again? If they failed back in March, that was only a couple months ago. All the voters had spoken on that issue already, so why do they get to bring that back?
So what happens is they are allowed to, if they change the language in any capacity, then they aren't precluded from doing that. They can't run the same levy, but if they change even one little part of it, then that's not the same levy. And so here's an example. For Coeur d'Alene, for example, they, back in March, tried to pass this large levy, and it was supposed to be into perpetuity. Clearly, the voters up there thought that was a crazy idea. They weren't going to, vote to tax themselves into perpetuity, and they rejected it. So now the districts come back and change the time frame for that. Technically a different election, technically a different levy discussion, so they were allowed to do it. But I think what it goes to, and this is really a frustration I think a lot of property taxpayers have, is it's a refusal to accept no as for an answer by voters. And I think, school districts really do a disservice to their patrons and, frankly, to themselves when they refuse to listen to the will of their voters. And that then leads to a lot of distrust, and you see the sorts of things happening in North Idaho right now where there's just a huge fight going on, and that's because people aren't feeling heard, and it's understandable why they would feel that way if they've already said no, and something's trying to be pushed back down their throat anyway.
Absolutely. And so there's some interesting things around those levies too, with the West Ada levy and the Coeur d'Alene levy specifically. So statewide, there's no shortage of funding with public schools, as we saw earlier, talking about those statistics in the program. But for instance, the Coeur d'Alene School District has $21 million just in rainy day funds that they're just storing in the coffers. And that, for perspective, that's about 20% of their budget. In West Ada School District, they have a whopping $137 million in rainy day funds, and that's 36% of their budget. On top of this, they have all of the COVID funding. So why can't school districts just tap into all of these unspent reserves and all of this extra federal dollars to make up the difference for all of this funding they're trying to take from the taxpayers?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of whether or not they could. They certainly have the authority to do that. Idaho law provides districts the ability to do two things. They can, first of all, they can create a contingency fund off of their general fund appropriation. They're allowed to do that up to 5%. So Coeur d'Alene School District has done that repeatedly. So has West Ada. They're allowed to do that. That's actually a good business practice to save some of your money just in case there's financial problems later. But what becomes a problem is the creation of these slush funds, which are just there, but are never actually utilized. I served in the legislature back in 2008 when we had a recession, and I remember what it was like to cut into the Public Education Stabilization Fund, PSIF, and have to really go into those rainy day funds and utilize them. And that was hard. But what we never saw in those circumstances were places where districts had to, weren't able to find the resources they need. Yes, certainly there was a lot of cutting that happened. Some of those cuts were very difficult, but we never saw a situation where a district needed to have $136 million sitting in its bank account and then go ask for another $500 million like the West Ada School District is doing. And so, as a patron personally of West Ada, I wonder, what would constitute a rainy day for them to be able to use those funds? Why are they there? And why is it incumbent upon them when when I and others, throughout the state of Idaho and throughout the country are experiencing hyperinflation, where cost of goods is just astronomical? Why are we being asked to foot the bill for something when we have access to the resources right now to be able to pay for the things that are the highest priority?
Absolutely. And we're talking about some really big numbers here that would be coming into these school districts if these levies do pass. And so let's imagine these levies passing. If they do pass, what are these schools going to spend the money on?
So looking at West Ada in particular, they are going to be, they claim that every single school district, every single school in the district will see some benefit. But as all things, Niklas, the devil's in the details, right? One of the things the West Ada School District is proposing to do is to expand their career technical education program, which isn't a bad thing. I would point out the state just invested a whole bunch of extra money into that system that the district doesn't remind us that the money's already coming for that. So there's kind of a double dipping that happens there. But within that program is an opportunity that they're creating a daycare facility that's going to be exclusively available to West Ada School District employees. Oh. And the cost of that that daycare program will be bore by property taxpayers and subsidized to their employees. What doesn't make sense about that is there are tons of privately owned daycare facilities throughout the Treasure Valley who would love to have high school students be trained and go work for them in an internship type capacity, instead of creating a government program that's going to compete with the private sector. So, there's all these different programs, and some of them there legitimately are needs, right? There's holes in roofs. Yes, that needs to be fixed, but that's why you have $136 million sitting in your reserve. That's why for Coeur d'Alene School District you have, what actually is $25 million when you add in the $4 million of contingency funds that they say from the last general fiscal year. So that's where you spend that money, not on these sorts of wants. You have to be diligent. we don't just go out and buy new things just because we want them. We need to go out and buy things because we need them. And when you're asking somebody else to pay for it, it's all the more important that you exercise a high degree of fiscal discipline.
Absolutely. And I mean, to build on the point that West Data is using the funds for the CTE education and the daycare centers, mind you that just this last legislative session, not only did we invest a ton of money into career and technical education already that Idahoans are already paying for, but the daycare centers throughout the state are also getting a lot of money to not only expand their operations but increase training opportunities and to grow their staffing levels. And so it sounds like school districts are kind of double dipping on the taxpayer to try and reap the benefits of these programs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what it also is indicative of is a further reliance upon the taxpayer to subsidize systems that should be paid for by the private market.
Exactly.
And, if you've got a situation, let's say, in the CTE world, I mean, certainly CTE programs have their place, and there's nothing to say bad about those. But there are a lot of private employers who would be more than willing to foot the bill to train students to do those things, and then that doesn't cost taxpayers any more to do that. So it's just a matter of philosophy if you believe the government should be running everything, or if you believe that the private system and individual decision makers should be making decisions instead of the government.
Exactly, and we see the government runs everything super well and super efficiently.
That's
already.
been my experience. Is that the government? You just look at our southern border right now. It's the perfect example of a well-oiled machine. If by well-oiled machine we're talking about an ability for those that are not legally allowed to be here to cross over the border. So we can do better. The private market would do a better job, but that's the decision of the voters to make.
Absolutely. And so this brings us to our final topic I want to make sure we hit on. The public schools have this unbridled control over the budget at both the state and the local level. So they have this very compelling case where the money that they get is going to be for the benefit of the kids that they're teaching. And so what I noticed when I was going through all those budgets, when these agencies, when the public schools make their requests to the governor for whatever line items they need, you go all the way down to the very bottom of the request, and there's this one question that they have to ask, or they have to answer is, what's going to happen if this doesn't get funded? And it is always like this vague threat. It's, well, if this doesn't get funded, we'll find other means of funding it, i.e. through property taxes. And that's literally what it says on the paper. So they threaten our governor, they threaten our legislators that if you don't fund this, we're just going to take the money some other way. And it just kind of circumvents the legislative process, it circumvents the appropriations process, and it creates this a never-ending spiral of money that has to come from the taxpayers, either be it through money that goes all the way up to the state level or money that just stays at the local level to fund the district priorities. And so what can be done at the legislative level to kind of curb this unfair practice of taking money from the constituents when the answer is clearly no on a lot of these things?
Well, I think part of that's a really big question, and it's a policy question and it's a budget question. So on the policy side, there's almost a perverse incentive to ask for more levies, right? If you're a district and let's say from a budget standpoint you don't get as much from the state as you want, then you're incentivized to go ask your local property taxpayers to increase that amount.
Gotcha.
The problem with that is that it's completely disconnected from the totality of the income stream that the district is getting, which is, by the way, almost exclusively coming from from taxpayers in some form or another. And so one of the things that could be done, and a thing that I think should be explored more closely, is creating a system by which where raising property taxes to local level actually reduces the amount of money you're eligible for at the state level.
Gotcha.
Because unless that sort of connection is made, then there will continue to be this perverse incentive to continue to ask for more and more and more because there's no accountability for that choice, right? You look at West Ada, for example, you look at Coeur d'Alene or Lakeland or any of the other number of districts that are asking for levies right now. If those levies fail, a lot of them are threatening things to their patrons to kind of coerce them to make a decision. But whether or not that levy passes or not, there's nothing that will prevent them from asking for more money later. And there's nothing that would make them second guess whether they should or not. And that's the problem. If there's no natural consequence to a decision, then you're going to continue to do the same thing over and over again. And so we need to be able to create some sort of corrective measure that allows for us to be able to say, hey, we get that maybe a district wants to get more money through their property taxpayers, but if that comes at the expense of getting more state funding, then maybe they would choose differently.
That's fair. Realistically, do you think anything will be done about this?
Yeah, in the near term, no, I think it's not. The big problem, of course, and you've probably spoken about this before, I'm sure you've read about this quite a bit, Niklas, is the funding formula in the state is a disaster. Mm-hmm. And this really needs to be a part of that conversation is how do we, get districts away from using property taxpayers as their backstop and really be able to start looking at how do we more appropriately fund our schools, not necessarily, definitely not through a higher rate, but how do we utilize the existing revenue we have better so that districts are able to pay their bills, but also be able to protect the property taxpayer and the taxpayers in general. So,
absolutely. Well, that's all I have for you. Thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this great conversation with Branden. Once again, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel to stay up to date with the latest developments in Idaho politics. To see more of Branden's work or to catch more episodes of Fiscal Fridays, articles, analyses, and more, please visit idahofreedom.org. See you next time.